Hey y'all, Andrew here with Free Tours by Foot New Orleans, and today I'm here to give you some tips on how to take a swamp tour while you're visiting New Orleans. If your question is, should I do one of these? That's really easy. The answer is yes. These are tons of fun. I love doing them when I get the chance. They have a lot going for them. You get to get out of the city and see something really different. There's a natural backstory to New Orleans and the area around it that these make really clear. If you take an airboat, it's kind of a roller coaster ride on top of all that, and it's a kind of nature that a lot of people from other places have never seen. So if when you travel, you like to do something that you kind of can't do anywhere but the place you're visiting, this really fits that bill. There are some challenges, though, around making them happen. There are lots of companies that offer them, and they're all a little different from each other in some small ways and some big ways. Cost can vary a lot as well. And transportation logistics are something you got to think about because most of these are located a little ways outside of the city. So we'll get into all the different factors that'll help you find the right choice for you. And we'll also include some free or non-guided ways to see some wetlands. You don't necessarily have to take a tour to make this happen. What we're not going to do here is list out all the companies that are your options. We actually have that in writing, which I think is a better way to do it. Once you've watched this and we've gone through some of the basics so you kind of know what to think about, check that out. We'll have it linked in the description, and there you'll also find some discount codes that with some companies will help make this a notch more affordable. So for starters, let's get into some context about why swamp tours are a thing people do here. So if you look at a map of Louisiana, a lot of times we describe it as looking like a boot. You hear that about Italy as well. Italy's like a runway show boot. We're like a walking around in the mud kind of boot. And the bottom of the state of Louisiana, the part that touches the Gulf, that's the mud on the boot. So a lot of the lower part of the state is as much water as it is land. It's stuff that human beings have a hard time getting around in. So you could tell the whole history of Louisiana and of New Orleans as a relationship between humans and water, us trying to make it work with each other. A lot of that's thanks to the Mississippi, the big river that runs through town. It has been running its current route for a few thousand years and steadily building land that's kind of land, kind of not. And because its geology is so different, it's just above sea level, it's full of water, the ecology that goes with that is really different too. That's why when you go out to the swamps, you see alligators and turtles, things that do well on water and on land. You'll also see a lot of water birds out there, things like pelicans and egrets. It's also where you can see bald eagles, which, as our national bird, are actually kind of hard to find in a lot of the country. You'll see cypress trees growing right up out of the water, and you'll also get a feel for the human connection with a lot of this stuff. Cajun culture and a lot of other rural cultures really exist in response to wetlands and what they provide, their cuisine, the way they build, all of that stuff. Those cypress trees are also the material that a lot of New Orleans buildings are built out of since it's water resistant. And a lot of New Orleans and a lot of inhabited areas here come from draining swamps. That brings us to some of the logistics of getting to them. Because the swamps in the area around the city have mostly been drained, to get to one, you're going usually at least half an hour in some direction or other from town. There are exceptions to that, things you can find within the city. We'll get to that a little later, but for now, a few thoughts on transportation. So, a lot of the companies that offer a swamp tour understand that transport is one of the challenges, and they will offer shuttles. Some of them will pick you up at hotels in the French Quarter area. Some of them have a central pickup somewhere. A lot of them also will package like a multi-stop itinerary. Since you're leaving town, the thought is make the most of it while you're out there, and typically that's going to mean going to one or more plantations somewhere near where the swamp tour takes place. So there's advantages to going the shuttle route. There's the convenience factor. Sometimes the driver is a little bit of a tour guide in their own right. They'll give you some commentary along the way about what it is you're seeing. The downside, which maybe is worth it, is that this, of course, increases the cost, usually about doubling what a ticket is going to go for. The other option is self-transport, and this is maybe one of the very few reasons to rent a car while you're in New Orleans. I usually am dead set against the idea, especially if you're new to town. Navigating New Orleans can be kind of confusing, and trying to park and stuff in the French Quarter area is really just not worth it. But if you're just going to rent a car for a day to get out of town and do a few different things in the area around the city, that's where it can really be worth it. And it might even represent a savings compared with shuttles if you're doing enough different stuff. Driving yourself also represents opening up some options around which swamp tour you maybe take. Some of them don't offer transport but have a lot else going for them. It also opens up different plantations that you might go to if you want to package that in. Typically the package deals only come with 1 or 2 different plantations as options, and there's a lot more that might land better with you. And it also opens up options around what route you take. Typically, the itineraries that are put together by a company are going to go the fastest way, which means going along not terribly interesting highways. And if you're going on your own and you have a little bit of time to spare, I'd say think about driving along the river road where you can get a glimpse of rural Louisiana and what kind of supports New Orleans and all the other big cities in the state. We did a road trip series going up the Mississippi. One installment of it covers things you'd see along the river near New Orleans, and another installment of that gets into plantations along the river not far from the city. So check those out for a few more ideas in that vein. Okay, so that's how you get to the swamp. Next, you get to think about how you get around the swamp. Different companies use different kinds of boats, and this is the variable in the experience of the tour that you have the most control over by picking a company in advance. So, of your different boat types that you're likely to see, the first and most common one is what gets called either a pontoon boat, a flat bottom boat, or sometimes just a swamp boat. These are craft that pretty large, they move slowly, they're motor powered, and they're generally covered, so they're protected from the elements. These are the ones that, because they're the highest capacity, they're the likeliest to offer you options for a last-minute booking, and they're also the cheapest option. Tickets for an adult, not counting transportation, are usually going to be in the $20 to $30 something range. At the opposite end of the spectrum, you have airboats, also sometimes called fan boats. So those are smaller, and that makes them more expensive. This is the most expensive option, but there are plus sides that come with it. They cover more distance, they can alternate between moving really fast and slowing down, so you get to see, for some moments, a big panorama of the wetlands, and then it'll slow down and you get to see the fine detail, the wildlife, etc. And so having that big and small picture thing might be an advantage. Speed also means you get some wind in your face. And depending on the time of year that you're here, that really might be a game changer. It also is where that kind of roller coaster effect that I mentioned comes from. You have very, very well-versed fan boat drivers who can zoom you towards a little island and like veer off at the last second, or they know the swamp so well that they know what kind of looks like land but isn't, and they might act like they're going to slam you straight into it and the boat just sort of hops over it. There's a thrill element to a good airboat ride, which, depending on who you are, might be a plus or a minus. More consistently, a minus is the noise factor. Airboats are super loud, and tours that offer an airboat ride are always going to give you ear protection, but you'll know yourself as to whether that is something that you would enjoy or not. So speed, variety, and maybe novelty factor are the things that airboats have going for them. I like these a lot, but in terms of cost, they are an indulgence, and what's a plus for me might be a minus for you. Finally, your third option is kayak or canoe tours. These are going to be mid-level pricing, and you probably know if this is the right option for you. You get an athletic experience out of it. The boats can get into tighter spaces that larger boats can't, and you get to have a little more control over what you're doing. A guide is going to determine the route, but if you're curious to get a little closer to something and get your own view, you have that extra bit of say. And on that note, if you like the idea of having this experience to yourself completely, a lot of companies also offer private tours, so that's something to look into if it might appeal to you. Now, there are a couple of other more minor factors, that are harder to control and also might make a difference in your choice. One of those is timing. Obviously, you only have the dates of your trip, and to maximize your options, you should book well ahead, or at least think about it, especially if you're going to be here in the spring when everything in New Orleans is at its busiest. But the weather on the day of your tour can make a big difference. The obvious thing there is whether it's raining or not, and that's kind of a matter of taste. I would say read the cancellation policy for a company before you commit, just to know whether their decisions about rain are going to line up with your feelings about rain. Rain doesn't make a huge difference around whether you're going to see wildlife or not, but temperature sometimes does, particularly when it comes to alligators. So alligators, which are what a lot of people are expecting to see on these rides, they don't hibernate, but they do a thing called brumating, which is not seasonal but temperature-based. So when the temperature is below about the mid-50s, they're going to burrow down into the mud and disappear. So it might mean that if you're here for 3 days and you're here during the time of year where we get sudden cold snaps, the alligators might be out one day and then hiding the next. So if you're making a last-minute booking, you might have some control over which day you pick. If so, pick a day based on whether you want to see alligators or not. Anxiety and excitement are kind of flip sides of the same emotion. Alligators are going to provoke one of those in you, and you know which one it's going to be best. One more timing factor that you may have some more control over, between June and September, the hottest time of the year here, some companies will offer a nighttime swamp tour. If that sounds fun to you, then you're right, you should do it. They're only available during those hottest parts of the year though, so look into that in advance for sure. The other factor that's maybe harder to control, but still worth knowing about, is the kind of things you might learn. So different tour guides and different companies are going to focus on different things. Ecology is a big part of it, the animals and the plants, the science of that, the human relationship with all of this stuff, hunting seasons, Cajun and rural culture, or even occasionally sometimes you might see the remains of old forts built during our colonial periods or abandoned towns. Another theme that comes up sometimes is coastal land loss, and this is a huge thing in 20th and 21st century Louisiana. The wetlands are a really important protective buffer from things like hurricanes, but they're also really fragile. And as we dig canals through them for shipping purposes and also for laying down oil and gas pipeline, both really big industries here, we make them exposed to more erosion, and we also let salt water in that kills a lot of the plant life that holds the wetlands together. So we typically express coastal land loss around a figure of losing about a football field every 45 minutes from the coast of Louisiana, which has added up to a lot by now, and it really is the story of what's happening with these places in the present day. Whether you'll hear about that or any other topic, like I said, is largely down to the guide you get. And that's true with any tour company. Generally, that's not a factor that you're going to have a lot of control over. But some companies focus on certain topics. If one of these things is particularly interesting to you, then the name of a tour company or their web presence might help you understand what you're likeliest to hear about. We also have some options for you to be able to see some wetlands without either committing to a tour and maybe without needing car transport as well. There's some state and national parks that contain wetlands or are entirely wetlands, things like Bayou Sauvage or Jean Lafitte National Park. Jean Lafitte actually has a small visitors center in the French Quarter, which is basically a free museum on this subject matter. They do historic talks. They also house the Jazz National Historic Park as of right now, so you might see live music performances there as well. And both of those locations are within a fairly short drive. The Visitor Center is a walk from the French Quarter. It's within the neighborhood, but the two parks are a drive that wouldn't take you too long, and you can visit those for free, do some nature trails that are kind of typical of what you'd find elsewhere, and some boardwalks out over the wetlands to get a really up-close view of it. We also have within the city Park. And that is actually where we are right now. We are not in a natural wetland completely. We are along a bayou that has been given some man-made enhancements, but you're seeing a lot of the stuff that you would see in a wetland. And for some people, maybe the advantage of this one is that you have parking right next to it and you have a Café du Monde right next to it. So if you like nature, but with a little bit of distance, maybe this is a really good choice. City Park also contains a couple of nature preserves, Scout Island and Couchery Forest, if you want a little bit more immersion in nature, but still close to all the other amenities. Within the city, we also have a waterfront area along Lake Pontchartrain, a little north of the areas of town visitors typically go. And out there, speaking of museums, you've got a small lighthouse, which functions as a museum, paid tickets in this case, but very reasonable, around the ecology of Lake Pontchartrain and our relationship with storms, man-made canal that opens up into, its story is told there as well. So you can cover a lot of different bases around the kind of things that I've been mentioning to you. Also, the Audubon Zoo in New Orleans has a pretty incredible Louisiana exhibit. So for another somewhat insulated view of the wetlands, there you go. And they have not only alligators, but white alligators, which you are probably not going to stumble across out in actual nature. And finally, just for a glimpse of this stuff, to get some of the beauty of it, from the French Quarter, you have the gallery of an incredible artist named Frank Relle, who's a photographer that goes out and captures wetland views at night. And that, I would say, is the perfect prelude or even substitute for taking a swamp tour if time or other resources are in short supply. Also worth mentioning, if you're going to visit one of these park areas, access may be a little bit seasonal, and it may also be restricted after storms, which can fell trees and block paths. And the biggest thing that I have to emphasize, if you're going to these places on your own, any tour guide will tell you this if you take a swamp tour, but please, please, please don't feed the wildlife. Alligators and other animals naturally have an instinct to avoid humans, but feeding them messes with that instinct, and they're likely to approach people in the future, and it could cause really big problems for us and for them. So just stay well clear. Even if you bring food for yourself, don't leave anything behind. Yeah, we talked a lot about the human relationship with wetlands, and you kind of can't go to these places without seeing the human imprint on them. We have various species that you can find in them that wouldn't be there without human intervention. So if you see a wild boar while you're out in a swamp, those are there thanks to Spanish colonists who wanted pigs to be easy to hunt. You also might see a thing called a nutria, this like otter-like creature, but a lot uglier with big orange fangs. Those were introduced by the fur industry. And these things cause a lot of damage, but maybe the most damaging invasive species in the swamps is the most innocent looking. That coming up in a second, y'all, but really quick, as you likely know, we have a lot of other videos on this channel that get into things like this, stuff for your itinerary while you're in town, some tips on how to pick the right thing. And we also have videos that get into the scenery in City Park, and one that was made in partnership with our friends at Kayakity Yap Kayak Tours, who do a kayak tour on Bayou St. John right inside of New Orleans. So another option for you to consider, and you can actually see a little bit of what that one would be like right here on the channel. And like I mentioned earlier, y'all, we also have this blog post that'll list out a lot of your options for swamp tours, getting into what each one offers on these various factors that we've been talking about here. So links to that and to these other videos are down in the description. And if you found this video helpful and you'd like to tip your guides, you can find the information for how to do that down there as well. Thanks so much. Okay, so if while you're out in a wetland, you see a delicate, beautiful blue flower, you're looking at a thing called a water hyacinth. And this is one of the most innocuous but most damaging invaders of the wetlands that we have. Water hyacinths came here through an odd series of coincidences. So we hosted an event in 1884, sort of a World's Fair, and the Japanese delegation in that fair handed out these beautiful little flowers to people for free, and a lot of people brought them home, found them charming, and tossed them into a pond or a nearby river. And they're pretty when you look at them, but as soon as you turn your back, they multiply 20-fold. So very quickly, they blocked whole shipping waterways, and they grew so heavy with that enormous biomass, like construction equipment would break trying to pull them out. So they've become this massive problem over time, and the problem was so bad in the early 20th century that the US Congress actually seriously considered importing hippos, which eat these plants, to fill the wetlands of Louisiana, and they regarded them as also a potential source for meat. So what you won't see going on a swamp tour is a hippopotamus poking its head out of the water, and you also won't see hippo steak on menus in the French Quarter, but we came that close to that being the case. That's all we got for this one, y'all. Please feel free to share in the comments your favorites of swamp tours that you've taken in the past and what you liked about them. Help everybody else who's new to this find their way around. We appreciate y'all watching. See you next time.